Alec Kowaleski, your instructor for pesticide applicator training here, and our first lecture is in laws and regulations. So this lecture is going to be mostly applicable to your laws and safety portion of the applicator exam. We're going to talk about how that relates to most pesticide applicator licenses, and we'll be covering some federal laws, Oregon laws, and specifics in Oregon licensing. And in your Canvas material under the module titled Supplemental Reading, you can find more information on these federal laws in the National Pesticide Applicator Certification Core Manual. You can find more information on the Oregon laws in the Oregon Core Manual Addendum, and then you can find more information on Oregon licensing specifics in the Oregon Pesticide Licensing Guide. So that's all within the supplemental reading folder of the course here. Okay, so let's talk about federal laws first, and then I'll work our way into Oregon laws and Oregon licensing. So federal laws first. Okay, we've got a variety of different federal laws here that we're going to spend some time working on. There's the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. There's also the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, also known as OSHA, the Worker Protection Standards, WPS, Hazard Communication Standards, and the Endangered Species Act. So all these acts are heavily involved in the laws and regulations that govern pesticide applicators in the state of Oregon. So let's talk about each of these individually here. And we'll start with the FIFRA Act, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Okay, so under this law, the United States Protection Agency is responsible for registering all pesticides, approving pesticide use, approving pesticide labels, and I think most importantly for testing purposes, when we're studying this information, the FIFRA, or Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, is what defines a pesticide as general use or restricted use. Okay, so that act, the FIFRA Act, differentiates between general use and restricted use. And this is important here because a general use pesticide can be purchased and used by anyone. Okay, a registered pesticide, on the other hand, or excuse me, I should say a restricted use pesticide, on the other hand, can only be purchased by a person with a certificate for pesticide application, and it can only be applied by a person with a pesticide applicator's license. Okay, and we'll talk about the different licenses later, but this is the big thing. Why you're taking this training is so you can be a person that can purchase and apply a restricted use pesticide versus a general use pesticide. And this is relating back to FIFRA. Okay. Okay, so our next law or act that's related to pesticide use is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, FFDCA. And the FFDCA Act is administered by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And I think the important thing to focus on when we talk about the FFDCA, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, is this quantifies legal residue. Okay, so residue is a small amount of pesticide left on the surface. So if you go to the store and you buy an apple, that apple will have a small amount of pesticide left on it from when it was treated with insecticides to stop insects from eating the apple. And that small amount of pesticide that can be left over on the surface of the apple is legal as long as it's within or under the specified residue level by the Food and Drug Administration or the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. Okay, so remember here, residue is relating to the concentration that can be left on food, and that's related back to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Okay, so the FFDCA is talking about residues left on food. Not very applicable to a pesticide applicator and turfgrass management, but more in farming aspects. But it's a major law that's a crux or a center point for our federal laws related to pesticide application and pesticide safety. Okay, so we're working our way through the list here. The next one is OSHA, or Occupational Safety and Health Act. In the OSHA law, employees must record and report accidents and injuries. Okay, so they must record and report accidents and injuries. Okay, employers must provide safety safety information and assistance to their employees, and they must provide their employees with worker protection standards, or WPS, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. But I think the big take home here from the OSHA Act is the employers must keep records of accidents, and then employers must also provide employees with worker protection standards, or WPS. So let's talk more about worker protection standards. So worker protection standards. Under the OSHA Act, the United States Environmental Protection Agency invented worker protection standards, and these are then enforced by Oregon OSHA. So that's Oregon Occupational Safety and Health Act. So there's a branch of the Oregon government that enforces OSHA laws, which entail worker protection standards. So let's talk more about worker protection standards. Okay, worker protection standards here. Employers must provide worker safety information, also known as safety data sheets. And down here you see an example of a safety data sheet here. Under the worker protection standards, employers must also provide training for employees, warning of application of a pesticide, and they also need to provide employees with personal protective equipment, supplies necessary for cleaning up spills or clean up after application, and worker information, and a worker information place or central posting material. Okay, so there needs to be a place on site on a farm or a research station or a golf course or some place that's associated with pesticide applications where information can be accessed by employees, and that's part of the worker protection standards. Okay. So worker protection standards, the central posting material is a central location where employers must post hazard information. So this includes things like the pesticide label and the safety data sheet, which we saw on a previous slide there. At the central posting material station, employers must also provide pesticide application information, such as when a pesticide was applied, what was applied, and when it's safe to go back into an area after application. Okay, and there also needs to be this poster that you see on the far right here, the protect yourself from pesticide steps here on the far right. So there, this center picture is our example of the central posting station that we have at the Lewis Brown Farm on campus here, where I do the majority of my research. And we also have our protect yourself from pesticides poster here, just adjacent to this central posting material board at the farm here. Okay. All right, so next on our list is the Hazard Communication Standards, or HCS. And the important thing associated with the HCS, I feel, is signal words. So the Hazard Communication Standard is how signal words were developed. So whenever you buy a pesticide, on the front of the label will be a signal word, and it'll be one of these 5 classes. Danger, poison, which is class 1 or the most concerning signal word, followed by danger, then warning, then caution, and then no signal word at all. So we're going from highest concern or toxicity to lowest concern and lowest toxicity associated with exposure to humans, that is. Okay. And another part of the hazard communication standards is the danger poison label comes with a skull and crossbones symbol. Okay. And this hazard communication standards is what produced the signal words and the use of the skull and crossbones symbol on a pesticide label. Okay, so working our way through the list here, now we have the Endangered Species Act, which is enforced by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the important thing within the Endangered Species Act that relate to pesticide use is natural habitat of endangered species. So when a natural habitat of an endangered species is identified, like a spotted owl, for example, pesticides are not allowed in these areas without special exceptions applied for and received from the Oregon Department of Agriculture. So that's the Endangered Species Act, and it protects critical habitat with endangered species and prevents pesticide applications without proper permitting or extra permitting in these areas. Okay, to sum this up real quickly here, let's go through these laws again and the big things that they represent. So the first one was the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, which is enforced by the Environmental Protection Agency, and that is how a pesticide is defined as general or restricted use. And again, people with pesticide applicators licenses are those that can purchase and apply restricted use pesticides. You can't apply those without a license. Okay. The next law we talked about, federal law, was the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is enforced by the Food Drug Association. And remember, we're talking a lot about food and the act and the association. So that law deals with residue on the surface of food, tolerable residue levels that are acceptable according to the government. Okay. Our next law or act that we discussed was the Occupational Safety and Health Act, or OSHA, and this has to do with reporting accidents to the government and protecting and informing employees, and it is enforced by the Oregon OSHA. Okay, the next thing we talked about was worker protection standards. Important things associated with that relate to pesticide use is the safety data sheets, which employers have to provide to employees, and the central posting material, which is a location on site where you're employed, where you can find information about pesticide applications, the label, the safety data sheet, when the product was applied, when it's safe to go back in there. And this is enforced by Oregon OSHA as well. Okay, the last 2 laws we discussed was the hazard communication standards, which is how the signal words and the symbol of the skull and crossbone for the danger, poison, pesticides was established. So every pesticide that we purchase will have a signal word on the front, which is associated with differing levels of toxicity associated with exposure to the applicator specifically. Okay, and this was made by the United States Environmental Protection Agency and is also enforced by Oregon OSHA. And the last law or act at the federal level we talked about was the Endangered Species Act. This is enforced by the Fisheries and Wildlife Service, and it identifies critical habitat for endangered species and makes it illegal or not acceptable to make pesticide applications in those critical habitats. Okay, so those were the federal laws that apply to pesticide applicator licenses. So now let's talk about a couple Oregon-specific laws. Okay, so the two major Oregon-specific laws we'll cover are the Oregon Revised Statute ORS 634. So this states that pesticides applied by aircraft require a valid aerial pesticide applicator certificate provided by the Oregon Department of Agriculture. So the ORS 634 is related to aerial pesticide applicator certification by the ODA. Okay, the other Oregon administrative rule, or OAR 603, is the other Oregon law we'll touch on. And within this rule, the Oregon Department of Agriculture controls the following things in the state of Oregon. So in addition to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the ODA also adds additional information or restrictions or requirements to pesticide registration and limitation. The Oregon Department of Agriculture establishes and organizes fees for licensing, testing, and the various categories associated with pesticide applicator licensing. They are in charge of applicators and dealer records and reports. So if you ever have to submit your application records, or if a person selling a pesticide has to submit their records and reports to someone, it'll be the Oregon Department of Agriculture. The ODA also allows experimental use permits of pesticides that have not been registered for a specific crop. If you want to use them outside of the registration, you have to get an experimental use permit from the Oregon Department of Agriculture. And finally, the Oregon Department of Agriculture implements civil penalties or punishments when you don't use pesticides properly, or you violate the labels, or you apply something without a license. So those are the different things associated with the Oregon Administrative Rule, or OAR 603. Basically defines all the things the Oregon Department of Agriculture does in association with pesticide licensing, application, and record keeping. All right, so finally, we're going to wrap things up with a couple slides on Oregon licensing. Okay, so in terms of Oregon licensing, the things we'll cover are the various license types that are available in the state of Oregon, which I feel relate closely to turf and ornamental applications. We'll talk about the different categories within turf and ornamental, and we'll conclude things with prohibited acts and civil penalties associated with pesticide applications in the state of Oregon. So let's talk about license types. Okay, so license types, the first two here are the pesticide dealer and the commercial pesticide operator. So a pesticide dealer is a facility that sells a restricted use pesticide. So anybody selling a restricted use pesticide has to have a special license for that. A company or a business that makes pesticide applications, whether it's general or restricted use, to properties for others or properties of others, needs a commercial pesticide operator license. So this is a business which gets paid to go make pesticide applications. Okay, so that's the difference between a pesticide dealer, person who sells pesticides, and a commercial pesticide operator, a company or business that gets paid to apply pesticides. So then, if we move a little further down the system, we have commercial pesticide applicators, public pesticide applicators, pesticide trainees, and pesticide apprentices. Pesticide apprentice. Okay, so a commercial pesticide applicator is a person that applies a pesticide, and again, this is general or restricted use, while employed by a commercial pesticide operator. So remember, that was a company that applies pesticides for money. So then a person that works for this company is considered a commercial pesticide applicator. Okay, a public pesticide applicator, on the other hand, is a person that works for a federal or state agency. So this could be a K through 12 school system, a college campus, a city parks and recreation department, any public employee that's applying pesticides, general or restricted use. Okay, they're applying a pesticide to the public grounds. They are a public pesticide applicator. Okay, the final two categories on here are the pesticide trainee and the pesticide apprentice. So the pesticide trainee is a person that can apply pesticides under the direction of a commercial or a public pesticide applicator. And for a pesticide trainee, the commercial or public pesticide applicator that's advising them or supervising them must be present. Okay, so for a pesticide trainee, when they go out to make the application, their supervisor, who needs to be a certified pesticide applicator, has to be on site for the application, accessible in less than 5 minutes. Okay, a pesticide apprentice, on the other hand, is a person that can apply pesticides under the supervision of a commercial or public pesticide applicator. However, the commercial or public pesticide applicator does not need to be present at the time. The pesticide apprentice only needs to be able to reach that person by phone, for example. So the difference there is the pesticide apprentice can make applications under the supervision of a commercial or public pesticide applicator, but the supervisor doesn't need to be present at the time of application. Okay, so if we focus on these categories here of the commercial and public pesticide applicator and the pesticide trainee and the pesticide apprentice, some things you'll see in common with the commercial and the public pesticide applicator are, for both of these licenses, the person will require the laws and safety section plus 1 category. So they'll have to take 2 exams minimum to get a application license in here. And we'll talk about categories in the next couple slides here and what that means. So the minimum requirements for a commercial and public pesticide applicator are the laws and safety exam, and then also an exam in 1 category. Okay, this license will then be valid for 5 years. Annual renewal fees have to be paid every year throughout these 5 years. And if the person wants to renew their license after the 5 years are up without taking another exam, they need to accumulate 40 professionally Oregon Department of Agriculture approved continuing education credits over the 5 years, with a maximum of 15 credits per year. So over that 5-year period of their license, if they go to approved training events and they get a cumulative number of 40 credits over the 5 years, they can keep their license for another 5 years. Okay, and keep doing that. Every 5 years you have to get 40 credits to keep your license, or you have to retake an exam to get a new license. A pesticide trainee does not require any exams. They just have to pay an annual fee to keep their license or have their pesticide trainee license. And they can only apply products that are within the categories of their supervisor. Okay, so their supervisor has to have a license associated with the category the pesticide trainee is making an application in. A pesticide apprentice, on the other hand, has to have passed the laws and safety portion of the exam and have a total of 8 hours of continuing education done annually. and they also have to pay an annual renewal fee. So all of these categories or all of these licenses require annual renewal. Okay, and the apprentice, like the trainee, can only apply products under the category of their supervisor. Okay, so we've talked about how commercial and public pesticide applicators have to have laws and safety and a category. So let's talk a little bit more about what the categories mean. Okay, so categories. What does the category section of the license mean? So again, all of the commercial and public applicators have to have the laws and safety exam, and then there'll be various categories underneath that. And I think for people taking this pesticide applicator training course related to turf, these are going to be the categories that relate closest to you. It's going to be the ornamental and turf herbicide category, the ornamental and turf insecticide and fungicide category, and then there's also an industrial, institution, health, and structural moss control category, which is for moss control and algae on structures, sidewalks, and driveways, not turf grass. But I think a lot of us working in grounds, golf, sports field applications could have to make moss control product applications to hardscapes, which would include this IIHS moss control category. So there's the major categories associated with your pesticide applicator licenses. Okay, so our third and final part associated with Oregon licensing is going to be prohibited acts and civil penalties. So quickly, let's talk about this. So there are civil penalties associated with improper pesticide use or label or license violations. These civil penalties are going to be state pesticide violations, law violations. Your first violation is going to be up to $2,000. Your second violation, I believe within a 3-year period, is up to $4,000. So that's if you make a mistake and you do something wrong associated with a pesticide law or application. And then there is also a gross negligence or willful misconduct. So this is a person that knowingly violated something significant associated with pesticide application. That fine is going to be $10,000. So you've got some lower level penalties here associated with mistakes. You've got a gross negligent or willful misconduct penalty of $10,000. And then you've got a variety of other penalties that the Oregon Department of Agriculture can enforce on you. That includes a notice of violation, which is just a written note that you have done something wrong associated with pesticide application or pesticide use. There is license denial, suspension or revocation, so they can take your pesticide applicator's license away. They can also make you do re-examination. So these are the penalties associated with pesticide misuse. The low-level initial penalties associated with mistakes, which are $2,000 for the first one, $4,000 for the second one. There's the gross negligence penalty of $10,000. And then the other penalties include notice of violation, license denial, suspension or revocation, and re-examination. Okay? So that concludes everything for our laws and regulations lecture. I thought I would quickly summarize the high points here associated with federal laws, Oregon laws, and Oregon licensing. Real quickly again, federal laws, we had the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, and this defines what pesticides are restricted in general use. You have to have an applicator's license to buy and apply restricted use pesticides. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is enforced by the FDA, the Food Drug Association. and that defines the acceptable residue that can be found on a crop surface. The Occupational Safety and Health Act, or OSHA, requires that employers report accidents and protect and inform employees of pesticide application, and it's enforced by OSHA. The Worker Protection Standards, or WPS, that law entails the production and availability of the safety data sheet, which the employer has to give a employee, and it also includes the central posting material, which is a location where you can find information about pesticides that have been applied at your location. Okay, it's also enforced by Oregon OSHA. And then you had the Hazard Communication Standards, which defines the signal words that are found on the front of a pesticide label. That's defined by the US EPA and enforced by OSHA. And then finally, the Endangered Species Act, which is enforced by the Fish and Wildlife Service, defines a habitat of critical or of endangered species and stops you from putting pesticides down on these critical habitats of endangered species. Okay, so associated with Oregon laws, we had a couple different types of license types. You had the pesticide dealer, a person or company that sells pesticides. You had the commercial pesticide operator, so this is a company or business that applies pesticides for money. There is the commercial pesticide applicator. This would be a person employed by a commercial pesticide operator who applies pesticides for that business. There is the public pesticide applicator. This is a public employee that works for a federal state agency and applies pesticides to that landscape on the federal or state grounds. And then finally, we had commercial and public pesticide applicators. This group of applicators has to have the laws and safety test done, as well as one category. The license is valid for 5 years with annual renewal fees. And if you want to keep your license after 5 years, you need to have 40 credits over that 5 years to renew your license. And to wrap things up here on our Oregon license types, we also had a pesticide trainee, which does not require any examination, just an annual fee. And this person can then apply a pesticide under the direction of their certified supervisor. And then finally, the pesticide apprentice is a person that has passed the laws and safety exam, has 8 hours of continuing education credits, has to pay an annual renewal fee, and can apply pesticides in the categories that are included in their supervisor's certification. Okay. So that wraps up our laws and safeties lecture on pesticide application or pesticide certification. Next thing we'll talk about is safety and handling associated with pesticide use. Hope everyone's doing well, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Later.